Hello ladies and gentlemen, Gapesty here. This is the Normal and Heroic raid guide for Brackenspore and Highmaul. And the basics for this fight are that you need to manage Brackenspore throughout the room as mushrooms and fungus grow up all around you, and deal with a number of pseudo adds that will spawn, in addition to one very large but frequent add as well. Now before the fight even begins, you will notice in front of the boss there will be two yellow glowing flamethrowers on the ground. And these are probably the most important aspect of the entire fight, because throughout the encounter, creeping moss will appear in random locations around the room and start to spread. And it's just these green squares or patches that will emanate out from existing patches. And it's similar to the heroic Ragnaros final phase mechanic, if you're used to that, except instead of just jumping on the stuff to get rid of it, like in that encounter, you have to utilize your special action button if you have a flamethrower equipped. Because you're only given two, you have to decide which raid members will be in charge of it. And we went with two hunters, and they seem to do a pretty good job. But generally speaking, it's got to be a ranged or a healer, since obviously melee running around would be no good. The general idea is that you just aim at the flamethrower at the creep and blow it up, but if you fire the flamethrower too frequently over a short period of time, it will overheat and you'll have a cooldown period. So you have to communicate with your flamethrower partner about where you're going in the room, where you're destroying the creep, all that good stuff. So let your flamethrower partners get a lot of practice on that, because it's going to be really important. If creep is allowed to spread, and it will do a lot of damage for any players that are standing on any creep, but more importantly perhaps is that it will heal any of the enemies, including the boss, if those enemies stand on creep. So you can't really see much on the screen right now, maybe on the edges. Yeah, there's some in the back left there, but eventually it will start to expand inward as the fight goes on. The second most important thing in terms of success and survival is properly managing the flesh eater adds. And these will always spawn from the same area of the room out by the water, so kind of behind me right now. And when one of them spawns, after just a few seconds, it will cast its first of many casts of the decay ability. So there's the big ad, you can see him back there. Now, decay is particularly important because it is interruptible, but if your raid fails to interrupt it, it does extremely high damage. Not enough on normal to necessarily wipe you, but in combination with a lot of the other miscellaneous damage, particularly from the main boss, it definitely will kill people. So the best thing you can do is to assign two melee DPS, most likely, that will be in charge of rotating interrupts on decay on the flesh eater at all times. That's basically their entire purpose for that period. So we used both of our warriors, our two DPS warriors, do a great job of this, because they can obviously interrupt the flesh eater and still do solid damage to it while also cleaving on the boss and whatnot. But the important thing is to assign two DPS that can rotate interrupts over and over and over until it's dead. The other DPS in the group don't necessarily need to focus down the flesh eater, but if your raid is having trouble with the interrupts or anything like that, then absolutely you want to kill it off quickly. It does respawn on a timer, so it doesn't matter if you kill it too quickly, as long as you're doing DPS to something. Now for actual DPS priority, the Mind Fungus and Spore Shooter spawns will take precedence for everybody except the two assigned Flesh Eater interrupters. All other DPS should kill off the Mind Fungus and Spore Shooters right away. The Mind Fungus is just a stationary mushroom that will generally spawn underneath players, and it has a small radius of aura that will reduce haste on everyone by about 75%. So obviously, because most of your raid will be stacked up frequently, keeping this active is not really any good. So you want to kill it off, get rid of that debuff. The Spore Shooters, they just spawn kind of random locations, and they will shoot random players. The targeted players will take damage as well as anyone within a couple of yards of that targeted player. And again, because your raid is often stacked up, the Spore Shooter's damage can be dangerous if you don't deal with them quickly. So just be vocal about when you see either of those ads spawn, so your DPS, particularly your ranged DPS, can quickly take them down. Now, probably the most interesting aspect of this fight is the mushrooms. These actually give your healers some interesting mechanics to handle, as well as your entire raid. It forces positioning, which is kind of fun. So there are two types, the living mushroom and the rejuvenating mushroom. Living mushrooms spawn about twice to maybe almost 3 times as frequently as the rejuvenating, but certainly at least twice as often. And what living mushrooms will do is while they're active, they will take damage on themselves. And once you heal them up to full, they will start to pulse a pretty massive healing to anyone within a few yards of them. So you can see the large rejuvenation style graphic above the mushroom there. So this will be utilized in a moment. We'll talk about the mechanic that you want to use that for. However, it's worth noting that both of these mushrooms, once healed to full, will take more damage over time than they were prior to being healed to full. And I can't say with certainty how much, but there's definitely some impact to healing them up. So what that means is for the living mushroom in particular, you're not going to want to heal it to full until you're just about ready to make use of its healing, because it will be more difficult to keep it active once you heal it up to full. So to that end, try to have 1 or 2 healers assigned to managing the health levels of those mushrooms when they first spawn until you're ready to heal them up to full. And then you can call, okay, max it out in Mumble or whatever, and then you can heal it up and utilize it. Now for the rejuvenated mushroom, once that one's healed to full, it does another small radius around it, but this gives you a massive haste buff, so it's a huge DPS increase. I believe it's 30%. Plus, it gives a lot of mana regeneration while you're standing in it. So because of that, as a healer, you can essentially spam your spells as long as your raid actually takes advantage of the first rejuvenated mushroom that comes out. If you can do that, you probably won't have any way to go out of mana on this fight, because it's just so much healing, or so much mana regen rather. Alright, so the next big mechanic to consider is really the most dangerous for the raid as a whole, and that is the Infesting Spores ability. This is cast pretty frequently. Anytime Brackenspore reaches 100 energy, he will start to channel it. And during this channel period, he will apply a stacking dot of Infesting Spores to everyone in the raid. So you can see us all gaining stacks there. And this damage ramps up as the stacks go up. It will max out at 10 stacks, and it lasts 3 seconds. So you'll have 3 seconds of the maximum damage to take during that. Now, on normal difficulty in particular, it is certainly possible just to heal through the damage without trying to utilize the mushroom mechanic. But there's no reason to do so, certainly because you're going to need to take advantage of it on higher difficulties later on. So the idea is that you want to save one of the living mushrooms such that you can heal it up to full just before Infesting Spores is cast, just before the boss reaches 100 energy. And then once he's about to reach 100, heal the living mushroom up to full, which you see we're doing here. And now it's full and he's casting Infesting Spores, so everyone then stands under the living mushroom and receives its pretty massive heal. And this greatly reduces the healing required for the healer team as a whole. And you don't even need cooldowns or anything when you're doing that. So very useful, and that pattern is just one that your raid, in particular your healers, need to get used to. The best thing you can do is communicate about when mushrooms are spawning, where they are, who's going to heal them to sustain them, and then when to heal them up to full, based on the boss's energy level. Other than that, the last thing to discuss is the tank sort of management. The only real thing to think about for tanking is the boss's breath attack. And this is fairly frequent on the current tank, but it is a cone attack, so it can hit anybody if the tank faces the boss towards someone. The important part is that in addition to doing a lot of damage, while the buff is active, it reduces healing on the tank by 99%. So this means that you want to make sure the tank is fully healed up before the breath goes out, as well as has any absorption shields that you might want to put on the tank active before the breath begins, because they'll be far less effective once it starts. Other than that, your tank should also be utilizing their own personal cooldowns when the breaths occur. And then some tanks, obviously, especially with magic reduction cooldowns, will be stronger than others for that reason. The tank swap mechanic is an ability called Rot, and it's just like all those other tank swap abilities. Once it reaches a certain stack level, your tanks will need to swap between the boss and the active flesh eater. So our tanks seem to be doing it around 4 or 5 stacks, and that seemed to work just fine. One thing to caution, of course, is that you tank swap between breaths from the boss, since you don't want both tanks in front taking the breath at the same time, because there's just no reason to do so. And on that note, it's also really important that your tanks, while tank swapping, watch that breath timer so that they don't accidentally breathe on the raid itself. So that covers everything for Brackenspore. As the fight gets toward the end, you may notice that creeping moss is coming closer and closer. So make sure your raid communicates to your flamethrower pair if there's moss, anywhere near the raid, particularly if you're stacking up under a mushroom or something like that, so that you have enough time to finish the boss off. Also, this is a fight that it's actually not such a bad idea to stack healing, because your healing can be utilized to heal up the mushrooms for longer, which can translate into extra DPS because you can keep the rejuvenating mushrooms alive that much longer once they're activated, and give the entire raid that much more haste and buffs. So in the long run, it might be that adding a healer gives more overall DPS than an extra DPS in this case, but it's hard to say. Anyway, that is the normal raid guide for Brackenspore. Pretty fun fight. Hope you enjoyed watching, and as always, good luck.